In this session, we are going to talk about the independent regulatory authorities and their need in the infrastructural or other sectors of the economy. There are several perspectives on what makes state to have independent regulators. An independent regulator is almost like a specific response to the need for promoting economic growth. Most of the infrastructural services are inherently non-competitive. Establishing a transparent and coherent regulatory regime can attract necessary investments to meet out the huge demand-supply gap and unlock economic growth potential. If you take the example of the telecom sector in India, for a very long time there was a bundled structure in the telecom sector. The regulator, the policy maker and the service provider was the same, which actually created monopoly, and that was not at all competitive in nature. That's a general perception. Therefore, the unbundling was required, and unbundling would make the regulatory agencies much more competitive and much more effective for governance. A regulator's role is also vital in establishing transparent systems, especially in matters such as cross subsidy and taxes. And it is also considered to be an important point that independent regulation is required to establish a transparency and protect the interest of consumers, particularly in not so competitive sectors such as infrastructural services. Transparent regulation is also considered to be essential even in the case of government monopolies. For instance, the Department of Telecom in India was transformed when the independent regulator like TRAI, Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, was created in the 90s, which actually brought in competition to the telecom sector. The independent regulator can also play an important role in tariff setting. It can also play an important role in promoting competitiveness, efficiency, protecting consumer interests, maintaining quality of services, safety, and also address the consumer grievances and so on and so forth. Now, if you look at the global scenario of independent regulation, broadly the independent regulation as a public policy emerged in United States in the 19th century. For instance, the first agency which was established as an independent regulator in the case of US was the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was established by American Congress in 1887 to regulate the railroads and later motor carriers, inland waterways, oil companies, and so on and so forth. Similarly, there were several other independent regulators in American context. For instance, there was a Federal Trade Commission which was established in 1914, the Water Power Commission which was established in 1920, and this particular independent regulator was subsequently renamed as Federal Power Commission, and Federal Radio Commission, which was looking at the broadcasting of radio programs and radio stations and so on and so forth. Similarly, in the UK, there are several independent regulators. For instance, Ofwat is considered to be one of the important regulators in the UK case. The Ofwat actually deals with the regulation of the water and sewage industry. Similarly, there is Oftel, which actually deals with the communication sector, and there is another independent regulatory mechanism called OFGEM, which regulates gas and electricity market in UK. Now, the various compulsions that led to the introduction of independent regulators worldwide apply equally to the developing countries such as India. So, let us talk about regulatory reforms in the Indian context in detail. If you look at the regulatory reforms in Indian context, it broadly emerged in the post-privatization phase, which was coinciding with the ascendancy of globalization in the early 90s. Independent regulatory authorities generally considered to be part of modern democratic governments, wherein it functioned within the executive wing with a certain degree of statutory or constitutional autonomy, reporting directly to the legislature. There were several independent regulators that are constitutionally mandated. For instance, Election Commission of India, Controller and Auditor General, Reserve Bank of India, and so on and so forth. They have certain kind of constitutional mandate to regulate certain sectors which are not intervened by the government of the day. In a way, these institutions, Election Commission of India or Federal Bank, came up with India's independence and after the inauguration of Indian Constitution. Subsequently, several independent regulators were created in different areas and fields. For instance, Securities and Exchange Board of India, which is called SEBI, which has enormous independence in terms of policy making, in terms of day-to-day operations, and so on and so forth. In general, there are 36 regulatory bodies which were established under the various acts of Indian Parliament. Now, when you take regulatory reforms in India in detail, the current phase of regulatory reforms have broadly started off in 1991-92 period with policy initiatives to permit private participation in the power and telecom sectors, and then in the port sector, and so on and so forth. The need to objectively regulate the entry of private sector and to establish a regulatory framework based on which private investment would be forthcoming was one of the key objectives that Indian regulatory reforms followed since 1990s. Independent regulators in the 90s were broadly set up in the arenas of power, telecom, ports, and so on and so forth. And there were also efforts to create independent regulators in other areas such as water and sanitation, health, so on and so forth. There have also been instances of setting up of regulation in insurance and pension fund management, and so on and so forth. Similarly, if you look at the financial sectors in India, there have been several new independent regulators were created. For instance, there was the Pension Fund Regulatory and Development Authority, and Forward Markets Commission, Insurance Regulatory Development Authority, and similarly there was also an attempt to create a regulator to promote foreign investment, which was called the Foreign Investment Promotion Board, and so on and so forth. In various sectors of the national economy, new forms of new types of regulatory authorities have come up, and most notable ones are Central Electricity Regulatory Commission and Telecom Regulatory Authority of India. Now, when you talk about regulatory reforms in the post-90s and the emergence of independent regulators, one should actually look at some of the legal and institutional changes which were brought into to the system. For instance, there was effort to there were attempts on the part of government to change many of the legal structures, institutional structures which were governing different sectors. Most of these legal and institutional structures were colonial in nature. Many of the legal and institutional structures in different sectors of Indian economy were governed by the legal or the institutional structures created during the colonial times. For instance, Indian Telegraph Act of 1885 or Indian Wireless and Telegraphic Act of 1933 or Indian Electricity Act of 1910. In a way, all these acts were trying to provide a certain kind of hegemony or certain kind of dominance to government departments, and most of these legal structures were providing the mandate to the government to act as the policy maker, regulator and also as a service provider. So, in that sense, many of these acts were broadly providing a bundled structure for the government, which in a way was required to be reformed in the post 90s